All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with our next meeting, which is an Education and Culture Committee meeting, which is a work session on our Office of Legislative Oversight report, which was our Montgomery County Public Schools performance and opportunity gaps. Again, always thank you to Dr. Bonner Tompkins for a very thorough report highlighting the great need that continues to exist in terms of reaching our racial equity and social justice. We know that it cuts across all of our sectors. We were just having a conversation earlier about our parks and recreation and some of the challenges that they face there. And we saw the glaring differences because from some of our areas that were more affluent versus our areas that were more impacted, and certainly saw the difference in terms of and so some of those were school sites that actually were the parks and play spaces on those particular sites. And so we know that this translates into a lot of what it is that we see, which is access. And certainly from that perspective, we want to make sure that we're doing all we can to ensure that all of our kids have access, something that Dr. Smith, I know in my conversations with him, on a very regular basis, embody. He embraces them and says that we certainly need to do more and want to do more. And I know that all of his staff believe in that as well. And so I know that today we're joined by Dr. Navarro. So Dr. Navarro, do you want to come up as well as who else is going to be presenting with you? But certainly, I want to start off by saying this. So I spent the last 3 years of my life on the Curran Commission, the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education. And a key component of the Curran Commission's work was around this very particular subject. It was around making sure that we figured out a way to make Maryland the best school system, not just in the nation, but in the world. And the only way to do that is to ensure that these performance and opportunity gaps were eliminated. And so a lot of the work that Dr. Bonner Tompkins has highlighted is addressed in our current commission recommendations as well. However, I think that on a very specific level, each jurisdiction, each LEA throughout the state is going to have to tackle the reality that everybody's doing it a little differently and everybody's got their own individual challenges in order to meet that ultimate goal of equity and justice for all. And so from that perspective, it's certainly, I'm very appreciative of this because this gives me a lot to think about when it comes to the actual current commission legislation about how there needs to be some flexibility, something that a lot of our LEAs asked for, but also our advocates in the community asked for in terms of making sure that we're addressing all of the local issues that we know are so important. Everything that spans the access when it comes to the resources and materials that are available for students to teachers and the quality of teachers that are in the classroom and how that disparity continues to exist, something that Dr. Bonner Tompkins highlighted for us before in previous reports as well. So let me turn to my colleagues to see if they have any opening remarks as well. I'm very excited about this because I think that this is, again, a recap of some of which we already know, some of the work that's already being done within MCPS, but the ask is for the commitment that these are going to be the things that we together say we're going to do and embrace moving forward. And so I've had a chance to skip ahead, as I oftentimes do, with OLO and go straight to the findings and the asks, and I've seen them and don't think that any of them are outside of what I view as reasonable, nor are in line with where MCPS is already headed in terms of their objectives and what they've said they want to accomplish and what your superintendent and your board has said we want to see happen within our schools. So, Councilmember Navarro?
Thank you very much, Dr. Bonner Tompkins. This, I think, was an eye-opening report because obviously we are all super familiar with a lot of the data and a lot of the growth in MCPS as well, and a lot of the goals. And every year we go through this process of the budget really pulling apart the budget in terms of trying to understand how are we investing, what is the strategic direction, what are we trying to do? And this particular report, I have to say, you know, and I marked it up significantly, was really eye-opening for me. We're at a period of time like no other, I think, in Montgomery County. When we were able to attend a Black and Brown Coalition meeting, that was extraordinarily surprising to me because for the first time in so many years as I've been doing this, there was such a large number of parents and young people coming together to say, we really cannot accept the status quo. And I understand how much MCPS and the Board of Education has been working to get to what it is that we have got to address here, and I get that. At the same time, as we always say, these children don't have the luxury of waiting and for us to figure things out. And so, again, I feel like we're in a very special moment. We were very strategic. I wanted to make sure that the superintendent and the members of the Board of Education attended these racial equity and social justice trainings for a reason. I am so grateful to the fact that this is something the board has taken on for a while, but I'm hoping through this conversation that the board, and I don't think I see any members, but that the board would consider, and perhaps maybe the committee can send a letter to that effect, consider amending their own policy to mirror what we did here, because unless we do that, then we're going to always have this disconnect, and we can't afford that disconnect. I'll have to say that when I saw the gaps in terms of funding for compensatory education and the results of that when it comes to our special education, our ESOL children, our farms children, this is absolutely just not acceptable at all. And so I would like to know, as we have this conversation, you know, what's happening with this coming budget. I would like to understand where are the barriers that have stood in the way of this distribution being what it has been. And lastly, I'll say, you know, once again, I mean, when I keep looking at these charts and these pie charts about who our MCPS students are, you know, it just the numbers keep getting larger when it comes to our Black and Brown students. Yep. And so I'll say this again, these are not the changing demographics, these are the demographics. And so when we all, and I include myself, when we all have to be accountable, we're not being accountable to some, you know, changing type of trend. We have to be accountable to our students. And it is a very robust budget, right? And so I'm glad to hear Chairman Rice talk about within Kerwin this idea of flexibility with jurisdictions. We in Montgomery County have really, truly always prioritized funding. And we've done everything possible. So it begs the question then, you know, how come the data that is presented in this report, you know, why was that? You know, why is it that we don't seem to be investing in the group of children, students that need it the most? And I know that we have a lot of students that come with interrupted education and informal education from other places. I understand that. But we've also looked at ways to address this. What are we doing with it, right? So anyway, I just really appreciate this. I was particularly touched by one of the things, I guess, from the Brookings Institute, Dr. Bonner Tompkins, that you talked about in terms of language acquisition. And it was exciting because I know that kudos to MCPS for looking at expanding dual language programs, because then again, language is an asset, so you're not tracking all these ESOL students, but you're also providing an opportunity to become bilingual for other students who may not be non-English speakers, and it helps with that tracking issue. And so this is something that I know it's been a priority for me, and I'm really excited. But we want to be your partners, as we've always done. We want to rock the boat if we need to rock it. Because, again, just being status quo is just not cutting it. And the percentage of students that we are not serving properly keeps growing. So again, thank you so much for this report, and I really do look forward to the conversation to see how it is that we here can support really changing this trend. Thank you.
Councilmember Juando.
Thank you, Chairman Rice, and to my colleagues, and thank you, MCPS, Dr. Navarro, and everybody for being here, and Elaine for your great work. You know, this is, if I had to boil down the one reason I ran for office and got in public service, it's this issue. And I've talked about it a lot. I went to school in this county. I've grown up here. I lost a friend to gun violence who went to school in this county due to lack of opportunity, which I found out over time. And this urgency, and Councilmember Navarro alluded to this, you know, if you talk about when I was at Oakview Elementary in, 1986 or 1987, all my colleagues, all my students, most of them were black and brown then, right? And so this is not a new thing. And then you fast forward to, and we just had a meeting on the ball field renovation, and Oakview Elementary was #1 on the list of being in the worst shape, right? And then we have a hearing a few months ago about after-school programming, and it's high on the list there. And I'm just using that as one example. There are many schools in places you can use this example. And so, I'm just wrapped up my first year on the council, and I can imagine to my colleagues who have been here much longer and then served on the school board, I can relate because of my life experience about how frustrating it is that and I'm sure it is to you as well, that, and this is not unique to Montgomery County, but how intractable this problem is to how to make sure all of our students have the opportunity they need to succeed, and that we are moving and closing the gaps and moving in the right direction. And while I want to acknowledge we have made some progress, and I know you'll talk about that in some areas, it's not enough progress, and it's not fast enough. I marched in 2014, so going on 6 years ago, with the first march to close the opportunity and achievement gap that Minority Scholars Program led, and I think that was MCPS supported, which was a great thing, and our students took charge, and here we are with a new set of students those students have graduated. In this Thanksgiving Day parade, I wanted to lift up the great work that's being done by the Black and Brown Coalition and the ERS study, which MCPS commissioned, and I marched with about 100 students from Minority Scholars and the Youth Advisory Committee and dedicated the time to them to talk, and they talked about their issue and their work. And I know they're in the student community. I bring it up because there's a revived interest in what are the students going to do to take hold of this issue and make sure that they're being advocates. And so us adults who are here, I really think that the time is long past that we say, okay, what serious structural things do we need to do to really get at this issue? And because, we've done things around the margins, we've made some incremental progress, but we are not where we need to be. And just, you can take Oakview, you can take my school, you can take a whole number of schools and just look, it's just not whatever we're doing. And again, not unique to Montgomery County. This is a problem everywhere. But I think we are uniquely, where we are unique, we're uniquely positioned, and we have the political will and the resources and I think the know-how to really, really make significant progress here. And so I just say all that to say that I think I speak for the members of this committee and the council in general, that we want to do that. And we need your guidance. And we know we work with the school board, and I know we have great leaders there. So I'm hoping that we can, in this conversation, understand why things are happening, and this compensatory issue is a big one, but also talk a little more broadly and systemically about the things that we think and how we can help you to really address this issue in a comprehensive way. So I appreciate the chairman.
So I'm going to turn to Dr. Bonner-Tompkins to walk us through her presentation, and then I will turn to MCPS to kind of give us an overview. I just wanted to read something that highlights and tees up, hopefully for Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, the urgency and why this report is so important right now. So I'm reading from our Kerwin Commission report. The alternative, continuing to do what we have been doing, is indefensible. It would mean that a large and growing fraction of Maryland students, those who are currently being failed by the system, will fall even further behind. That is an unacceptable outcome, unacceptable for those students and unacceptable for a state that will increasingly depend on the contribution of all of its citizens that can make to our economy, political health, and the quality of life in our state. That is why, from the beginning of its work, the current commission placed a special focus on addressing the needs of students who are being left behind by the current education system. The commission is recommending that more resources, staffing, funding, and attention be directed to the students who need it the most. Dr. Bonner-Tompkins.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, and I appreciate this opportunity to offer a briefing on this recent OLO report, Montgomery County Public Schools Performance and Opportunity Gaps. Before I begin, I want to thank the staff and leadership of MCPS for offering technical comments on the earlier draft of this report and the superintendent's letter, which is included in today's packet. I especially want to recognize Drs. Monifa McKnight, Janet Wilson, Keisha Addison, as well as Nicola Diamond for their feedback and assistance in preparing the report for its release. So this slide provides an overview of the topics I intend to cover in about 20 minutes. So given our time constraints, I would like to complete the presentation in its entirety before addressing any questions. So without further delay, OLO was tasked to review data on student performance and budget allocations to understand how MCPS targets its resources to close performance gaps among student subgroups. Performance gaps often reflect differences in educational opportunities rather than individual or cultural differences, and opportunity gaps reflect differential access to resources that promote learning and achievement. This current OLO report builds on prior OLO reports that have tracked achievement gaps and resource allocations within MCPS. So a review of MCPS's student enrollment data demonstrates that it's a diverse school system. As noted in the chart above, Latinx students were the largest student subgroup by race and ethnicity in FY19, accounting for 31% of MCPS enrollment, followed by white students accounting for 28% of enrollment, Black students accounting for 22% of enrollment, Asian students accounting for 14% of enrollment, and multiracial students accounting for 5% of enrollment. MCPS is also diverse when considering the different learning needs of its student subgroups. Among all MCPS students, 1 in 3 qualify for free and reduced price meals, 1 in 6 are English learners, 1 in 8 have a disability. If students were equally distributed across schools, half of each student subgroup would attend a higher poverty school. Yet in FY19, 3 in 4 Latinx students, Black students, low-income and English learning students attended a high-poverty school, elementary school, compared to fewer than 1 in 3 white, Asian, and multiracial students. So this slide shows the distribution of elementary Latinx and Black students. As shown by the blue slices, 78% of Latinx students and 71% of Black students attended a high-poverty focus school in FY19. This slide describing the distribution of Asian and white students shows that 30% of Asian and 27% of white students attended high-poverty focus schools in fiscal year 19. And this slide describing the distribution of low-income students and English learners shows that 83% of students eligible for free and reduced price meals and 76% of English learning students attended a high-poverty school. So, why does the concentration of Latinx, Black, low-income, and English learning students among MCPS's high-poverty schools matter? So research suggests that concentrated poverty can have an adverse impact on student performance, especially among students of color. All other things being equal, students of color and low-income students tend to experience better outcomes in more economically advantaged and mixed-income schools than in schools with high concentrations of poverty. The performance gaps by race, ethnicity, and service group described in the next set of slides suggests that concentrated poverty across MCPS campuses creates an opportunity gap that undermines the performance of student subgroups enrolled in MCPS's higher poverty schools. So this slide describes the 5 sets of student performance data reviewed by OLO. The metrics or measures reviewed range from school readiness data to college readiness data. A total of 12 measures across 5 sets of metrics were reviewed for each student subgroup by race, ethnicity, and service group status. This table describes performance averages by race and ethnicity for measures of school readiness and proficiency in English language arts and math on the PARCC assessments across 3 grade spans. It shows that Black and Latinx students were only about half as likely as Asian and white students to demonstrate proficiency in English language arts or math based on their PARCC scores. For example, 78 to 79% of Asian and white MCPS students demonstrated proficiency on the English 10 assessment last year compared to 31% of Latinx students and 39% of Black students. Next, this table describes performance averages by race and ethnicity for measures of college readiness and high school completion. It also shows that Black and Latinx students are only about half as likely as Asian and white students to demonstrate college readiness based on their SAT or IB or AP or IB performance. For example, 73 to 76% of white and Asian graduates from the class of 2018 earned at least 1 qualifying score on an advanced placement or international baccalaureate exam, compared to 32% of Black graduates and 40% of Latinx graduates. An analysis of trend data across the 5 sets of metrics reveals that performance gaps by race and ethnicity have not narrowed over time across most of the measures considered. For example, the gap in student performance between Latinx students and their white and Asian peers widened for middle and high school English language proficiency, college readiness, and high school completion. Conversely, the gap in student performance between Black students and their white and Asian peers remained unchanged or decreased on several measures, including Algebra 1 proficiency and 4-year graduation rates. This table compares the performance of students eligible for special education, ESOL programs, and free and reduced price meals to all students within MCPS. It shows that students receiving specialized services were less than half as likely as all students to demonstrate proficiency in English and math based on their PARCC scores. For example, 1/3 of all students demonstrated proficiency in Algebra 1 based on their PARCC scores, compared to 11% of low-income students, 9% of students with disabilities, and less than 5% of English learners. This table compares the performance of students eligible for special education, ESOL programs, and free and reduced price meals to students ineligible for these specialized services. It shows that students receiving specialized services were less than half as likely as their service program ineligible peers to earn SAT scores demonstrating their readiness for college-level coursework. For example, 65% of non-PHARMS graduates taking the SAT earned math scores of 530 or above in 2019, compared to 29% of graduates taking the SAT that received free and reduced price meals. Of note, the 4-year cohort graduation rates for non-ESOL students was 93% in 2018, compared to 47% for English learners. A wide disparity by limited English proficiency was also evident in the 4-year cohort dropout rate, where the dropout rate for non-ESOL students was under 4% compared to 36% for English learners. An analysis of trend data across the 5 sets of metrics also reveals that performance gaps by service group have not narrowed over time over most of the measures considered. In particular, performance gaps have widened between English learners and English proficient students, or all students, in middle and high school English language proficiency, college readiness, and high school completion. So, to understand how MCPS uses its budget authority to narrow its performance gaps by student subgroup, OLO reviewed MCPS budget data reported in its annual operating budget. There are 4 broad categories of spending within MCPS's current fund. The first are general education programs for all students. Second is special education programs, including related services for students with disabilities. The third are English for Speakers of Other Languages programs, ESOL programs, serving English learners. And the final are compensatory education programs, such as Title I and Head Start, that are designed to offset the negative impact of poverty on achievement among low-income students. This chart describes how MCPS's operating budget is allocated by function. General education accounted for 74% of MCPS's operating budget in FY19. The remaining quarter of the MCPS budget was allocated for service group programs, with the special education budget accounting for 18% of the operating budget, ESOL programs accounting for 3%, and compensatory education programs accounting for 5%. The next 3 charts dive deeper into revenue sources supporting each of MCPS's service group programs. So this chart describes revenue for MCPS's special education budget by source. County funding for special education, represented by the blue bar, has increased significantly over the past 6 years. In fiscal year 19, MCPS budgeted $454 million for special education, with county revenues of $356 million, accounting for 78% of the special education budget. State revenue accounted for 13% of special education funding, and federal revenue accounted for the remaining 9%. For MCPS's ESOL budget, state funding, represented by the orange bar, accounted for 92% of the $80 million budgeted in the fiscal year 19. Federal revenue accounted for about 4% of ESOL program funding, and county revenue accounted for the remaining 4%. This final revenue for service group slide describes trend data for MCPS's compensatory education budget. MCPS received a combined $171 million in federal and state revenue for compensatory education in fiscal year 19. At $142 million, state funding provided the largest source of revenue for compensatory education, followed by $29 million in federal funding. MCPS, however, only allocated $124 million of the $171 million it received for compensatory education programs for low-income students in high-poverty schools. In turn, MCPS allocated about a third of the state compensatory educational revenue it received for other purposes. The blue bars in the negative, ranging from $45 million in fiscal year 17 to $54 million in fiscal year 16, represent the state compensatory education dollars that MCPS allocated to other purposes. Of note, the allocation of state compensatory educational revenue for other purpose is allowed under state law. We noted this in our 2015 report describing MCPS resource allocations, and note this fact in the current report. However, given the persistent performance gap by student income and the concentration of lower performing subgroups among MCPS's high poverty schools, questions regarding the efficacy and the equity of allocating any compensatory education and revenue to other purposes should be revisited. The differences in MCPS budgeting for service group programs translates into wide disparities in per student budgeting by service group. Overall, MCPS budgeted $11,700 per student for general education in fiscal year 19. For service group students, MCPS budgeted an additional $22,900 per student with disability, an additional $2,800 per English learner, and an additional $1,600 to $2,000 per K-12 low-income student for compensatory education programs. These are not mutually exclusive categories of funding, so students eligible for more than one service group could receive additional resources across programs. MCPS also budgeted $6,600 per low-income student enrolled in Head Start and pre-K. This chart describes trend data on per-pupil budgets by function. Starting from the bottom of the chart and moving to the top, a review of the data shows that between fiscal year 14 and 19, the per-pupil budget for general education increased by 3%. For special education, the per-pupil budget increased by 26.4%. For ESOL programs, the per-student budget decreased by 3.5%. For Head Start and pre-K, the per-student budget increased by 19.4%. And for Tier 1 through 3 compensatory education programs for K-12 students, the per-pupil budget increased by 18.7%. This final slide on per-pupil budgets describes the cumulative funding budgeted for each service subgroup. With general education services available to all students, MCPS's per-pupil service group budgets, inclusive of general education in fiscal year 19, averaged $11,700 for general education only students, $13,300 to $13,600 per low-income K-12 student for general and compensatory education, $14,500 per English learner for general and education and ESOL programs, and $34,600 per student with a disability for general and special education programs. In sum, performance gaps by race, ethnicity, and service group persist within MCPS. Moreover, performance gaps among a majority of metrics reviewed have not narrowed over the past 3 to 5 years, and in many cases have widened, particularly for English learners and Latinx students. Two opportunity gaps that likely contribute to MCPS's persistent performance gaps are, first, the concentration of high-need and lower-performing student subgroups among MCPS's high-poverty schools, and two, the underfunding of compensatory education and ESOL programs relative to student need. In addition to low-income students and English learners bearing the brunt of these two opportunity gaps, students ineligible for these services but enrolled in high-poverty schools are also adversely impacted. This includes Latinx and Black students whose enrollments, as already noted, are concentrated among MCPS's higher poverty schools. Based on this project's findings, 3 sets of recommendations are offered. The first are recommendations for the council to discuss 2 issues with MCPS leadership. The first are MCPS's efforts to allocate additional funding to close opportunity gaps for Latinx, Black, English learning, and low-income students. And 2, to discuss the merits of using a racial equity lens to identify and remedy policies, programs, and practices that may foster or exacerbate inequities by race, ethnicity, income, and/or English language proficiency. This second set of recommendations are for council action as listed above. Develop a council resolution calling on the board to develop an integration and equitable funding plan to address existing opportunity gaps. Encourage the state to require the board to expend all state resources allocated for compensatory education on low-income students and/or high-poverty schools. Request the board to earmark county funding above state maintenance of effort requirements for compensatory education and ESOL programs. And finally, to request the board to annually report on student performance and resource allocations for general, special, and compensatory education and ESOL programs, similar to how these data points are reported in this OLO report. And a final set of recommendations are offered to the Board of Education as follows. to request a briefing from OLO staff on this current report and OLO Report 2018-8, Racial Equity in Government Decision-Making, Lessons from the Field, to consider adopting a racial equity and social justice policy analogous to the legislation recently enacted by the county, and finally, to partner with county government and other local jurisdictions in a community of practice aimed at advancing racial equity and social justice in government decision-making. So that concludes my presentation. I look forward to answering any questions that emerge.
So Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, as always, incredibly thorough. You've given us a lot. And what I don't want to do is jump into what we have here. I know that all of us already had notes and have been taking notes without hearing from MCPS. So let me turn to MCPS, Dr. Navarro. And I'm not sure if do you have slides or no? No.
We have a
Okay.
couple that we can refer to.
Okay, all right. So let me turn to you, and then certainly we'll hear from you as well as your colleagues, and then I'll turn to my colleagues for any questions or comments. So Dr. Navarro.
So good afternoon. I want to thank the county council members for inviting us in to make some comments about the OLO report. I want to first introduce who joins me from MCPS. So from my left to right, Kevin Lowndes, who is the Associate Superintendent for Special Education, Dr. Keisha Addison, who is the supervisor in our Office of Shared Accountability, Dr. Janet Wilson, who's to my right, as the Associate Superintendent, and Troy Body, who leads our equity work. So we thought we would come to you from a programmatic perspective, from a data perspective, so that we could comment on this report. First and foremost, I think we speak on behalf of the superintendent, thanking the county for continuing to put the issues around how we support all of our students, and specifically our highest need students, in how we do our work. We, as you mentioned, Mr. Rice, we completed a extensive report from, with the help of ERS, to take a look at exactly how we're utilizing our resources. Part of the conversations that we have is how do we allocate resources and request resources for, to support the learning of all of our students, but specifically the focus groups in our schools that can be and need to be achieving at higher levels. At the same time, we also worked with ERS to look at the current resources that we have available. How do we maximize those? And how do we make decisions around structures within the school system that we need to take a look at and change and evolve to meet the needs of our students today. We are happy to come and maybe unpack some of the questions that you have around some of our approaches around supporting English language learners. I know students with disabilities and students in poverty, affected by poverty, are some of the areas that we wanted to emphasize. So we are here to respond and talk through some of the areas. I did want to point out that here in this slide specifically, you've heard us talk quite a bit about the Equity and Achievement Framework, which focuses on, first and foremost, the evidence of learning, which is discussing, looking at multiple measures to really assess and proactively target and support and impact student learning for our focus groups. The equity accountability model takes a look at the school level and looking at the impact the school and has as an overall effect on student continued achievement. And as I mentioned before, the work of the ERS study gave us a lot of information around how we support the resources to students. So if you allow me, I'd like Dr. Wilson to talk a little bit about our current funding structure so that then we can take your questions and unpack some of the work that we're doing.
Good morning. I do want to first mention that one of the key focus areas of our work with ERS was not necessarily about how much money we were spending, but how well we were utilizing those funds. So it caused us to take a look at 7 of 11 dimensions rather deeply, and we found a significant number of questions that have arisen from that study that were involving a number of stakeholders, including the Black and Brown Coalition, in helping us in terms of recommendations for our budget. I did want to start out with, and I want to remind especially our viewing audience, that this is 17-18 data. That was our point of entry for this diagnostic, and that is really what it was. It was a diagnostic that was trying to answer the question, here's MCPS, a well-resourced school district. Looking at our outcomes, what are we seeing? We have the money as the inputs, but now we have these outputs that Dr. Bonner-Tompkins brought today. So what is it in between that may be creating these structural barriers and institutional racism, if you will, that are leading to these types of outcomes? So I'd like to switch to the next slide, Elaine, thank you. One of the things that ERS did tell us is that MCPS does an excellent job at stratifying its funding when we look at our schools in terms of impact. So if you look, the first series of slides, or the first wave, if you will, is our elementary schools. And we can see that on a per pupil funding basis, for our students in the lowest poverty schools, our per pupil is slightly under $8,000. That goes up to approximately $16,000 between our elementary schools. So again, roughly underneath $8,000 all the way up to $16,000 for our most heavily impacted schools. Our middle school range is slightly different, with approximately, the medium is 11,200 per student, with a range of about 8,000, again, up to about 13,467, with our high schools having the same trend as the middle schools. What we have learned from this, and this is in part due to the data that we have, as you well know, we have to use the free and reduced meals as a proxy for looking at poverty. We know, though, that when we have a high number of schools where we have heavily impacted students, our continued funding at middle school and high school for students who may have had been in poverty in elementary school needs to be examined, because we know that our elementary school children tend to apply for free and reduced meals, and our older students do not. So that is one area where we are taking a look at that support in the middle and high school, as we know that the impacts of poverty don't disappear just because students don't sign up for free and reduced meals. And again, I want to just express that ERS did laud that we do a great job of differentiating, and that's that how much. But again, it took us a layer deeper to say, okay, so how well are you using these funds in your most heavily impacted schools? So I brought the flyer from the Black and Brown Coalition because I just thought maybe I could very quickly cover some things that we're deeply examining. One of the areas of concern that was brought up at that coalition was that our Black and Brown students, particularly from low-income families, spend more time with novice teachers than do their peers. So we are looking at examining internal mechanisms where we can monitor our scheduling of students throughout the year. This has caused us to take a look at those practices at each school level, and also across content and grade level. That's one example of the answer to how well are we using our resources. I do want to say that we don't want to send the impression our novice teachers are in any way bad teachers. We know, though, the research says they need support, especially when they come into a school district as diverse as Montgomery County Public Schools. We also have to have in mind the type of training they had from their preparatory work at a higher ed institution and take them to where we need them to be to service our students well. So that's one example of what this study is causing us to look at, as well as our principals and their tenure in buildings, because we know that in order to galvanize a staff, we need good leadership. We need teachers who will want to stay in heavily impacted buildings, and we know that the attrition rates in some of our most impacted schools is higher than we would like it to be. So those are just two examples that this funding has caused us to take a deeper dive into those two areas of our dimensions of equity. There's others like time and attention, access to rigorous classes, which was brought up by Elaine, and we will continue to analyze and put that data forward for people to take action on. Again, the study was information and awareness to create sense of urgency and action.
So thank you very much for that. And so I'm going to turn to my colleagues, and I'm just going to go left to right, because I have a number of questions and a number of comments. But let me just say this. I think it's interesting that one of the things that I think is a good thing is that we embarked on boundary studies in Montgomery County Public Schools. And I think that, again, as Dr. Bonner-Tompkins has highlighted in her report, you've also addressed it in terms of some of the things, Dr. Navarro, that you said, that we have high concentrations of poverty schools surrounded by schools that don't have that high concentration of poverty. And we're seeing that now in the Up-County, where we redid some of those boundaries, and I think we've done a great job in embracing this and understanding that this is a part of the work, right? It's not the panacea, but it's one piece of the work that needs to be done. So kudos to MCPS, to the board, to the superintendent for taking this on, because it's incredibly important. It's an incredibly important part of this. So that's great. I will say that it's very interesting about the funding mechanism piece, and it's something that we found, again, in Kerwin. It's the reason why we recommended that funding follow the student, because I think that when you add up all of the different things, and if you look at Dr. Bonner-Tompkins' report on page 54, where she talks about teacher allocation and talks about novice teachers versus the percentages aren't as bad at elementary, and they get worse as you go up through middle and high school, to where you see more of that difference in terms of our novice teachers versus our more experienced teachers. Now, again, one of the interesting things is, in the work that we saw via Kerwin, is that in our elementary schools, it's not as, how should I put this? And it's still impactful, but the impact is not as great at elementary as it is when you have more specialized need, especially in our middle schools. And so what we found is that middle schools is where we need to focus on this more so than a lot of our other areas. That's where students are first starting to experience that challenge, where they may not be doing as well. I mean, again, it still happens in elementary school as well, but that's where, and as they prepare for then high school, is where then you start to get that disconnect, right? Folks aren't disconnecting at elementary school. We don't have disconnected youth, a preponderance of them in our elementary school level. That happens at high school. And so from that's where those teachers understanding how to best reach kids who may not see themselves going in a certain direction, all those kinds of things matter so much. And so that diversity of teacher cohort, having the resources that are there for those teachers to make sure that they know the best practices, what's worked with others, all those kinds of things, all of that resource is there for those children. And so we see that at both the middle school and high school level.
Chairman Rice, can
yes.
I ask, are you referring to the ERS report or the 2015 OLO report?
I think to the ERS report.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. So that being said, I think that for us, it's one in which that's where I think we need to do more in terms of ensuring that those experienced teachers are there. Part of me, and that's why I'm going to turn to my colleagues, part of me thinks that some of this will be fixed via Kerwin. But the key is that Kerwin's not guaranteed to pass. And so in the meantime, and that's why I love the recommendations that Dr. Bonner Tompkins, because as I went through them, I'm like, okay, that's in Kerwin, that's in Kerwin, that's in Kerwin. But the reality is that until the ink is dry from the governor either signing it or it being a veto override, we still need to do this work, right? And so we can't just assume that Kerwin is going to make this happen. And at a local level, we've done a great job of always leading the state when it comes to these kind of initiatives. I will just, and I'm just going to close with one thing, guys. I promised you I was going to try and be quick. When it comes to the money, one of the things that Massachusetts found out with its great advance is that they did great in terms of advancing everyone, but didn't do well when it came to eliminating the gap. They put a lot of money behind their recommendations. And so unless you're doing the dynamic work that means wraparound services for our kids, community schools in its truest form in terms of before and after school, when it comes to a heavy investment in early childhood education, all the things that we know are embodied in some of the work of the commission, and in these recommendations that Dr. Bonner Tompkins has put forth, it's not going to work in terms of eliminating the gap, because Massachusetts still has it. And one of the things that they commented on was that they did a great job of putting more money behind their students, which was great, but the reality is it still didn't get them the accomplishment that they want. And that's what I see in our results. I see that we've put a lot of money behind, which has helped people generally go higher, right? So we see the numbers. We're not talking about the fact that everyone has generally, for the most part, gone up. But what we've seen is that the gap either is still there, in some cases, in a lot of cases, is widening, and in some cases is decreasing, right? Park math, okay. So we've seen some success there, but it's still not anywhere to where we want it to be with the amount of investment that we've made locally in trying to make these strides. I'll talk about the state later. So let me turn to Councilmember Navarro, and then I'll turn to Councilmember Jawando, and then I'll have a couple other things.
Thank you. And I hope that maybe this is part one session, because there's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot.
Especially, as we are going to be addressing a lot of these issues under our purview, which is the budget process. So it would be great to have a lot of this kind of examined before we get to budget time. So a couple of things. Obviously, we look at the gaps in terms of school readiness, and so, okay, the county has launched an early care and education initiative. We can check that box as something that we have obviously recognized that we needed to do. It's clear. I mean, the fact that 70% of ESOL students are U.S. citizens, I think that's clear. The fact that we already see the gap presented when they enter kindergarten in terms of school readiness. So we need to address that. So we always talk about how the issue of high expectations is so important, right? Low-income students, students of color, we know that every student can learn and can, and is able to achieve very high standards. So the issue of expectations is one that we've examined for a very long time. So that's one variable that we always talk about. And then we talk about money. And now I've been here long enough and have gone through a lot of budgetary battles to where I can say that we always do everything in our power to make sure that we prioritize, right? And it is right now almost half of our budget, I believe. So money, it's something that we have put in there. So then we have the Black and Brown Coalition talking about the issue of novice teachers, and you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean that because you're a novice teacher, you're not excellent. You do need that support, right? But then it got me thinking about this issue of compensatory education funding, because if those novice teachers need to have support, this type of funding is also super important to alleviate whatever, additional barriers those students have, right? And then there is the issue of teacher diversity and also principal diversity. I'll be honest with you, I've had a lot of conversations with really outstanding Latino assistant principals and other folks who've said that it's been super difficult for them to be able to get to that place of being a principal. That there are barriers even within MCPS staffing in order to promote folks that have been in MCPS forever and are qualified. And if, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have discussed these issues and examined them and really worked towards answering a lot of those barriers that everybody has seen in research when it comes to educational best practices. But then what is giving me a little bit of heartburn is, is that slide on page 8 in terms of how the gaps, most of them have not closed, but some of them have widened, right? And so I'm just curious. So we've got the funding thing, checked. We've got the hopefully, right, at MCPS there is a culture of high expectations. We know that all children can step up. We've seen it. We've had some examples like the whole school magnet in the middle school. We've seen it. We know that, right? We are working towards diversifying the teaching profession or the staff. And so what's happening? I guess is my question. I mean, quite frankly, like, what is going on? Because we can't continue in this way. And even though, for me, when I kind of started getting engaged in this issue, the numbers were not as large, right, in terms of our Black and brown students. Well, now they are, right? And if you add our Asian students, right, so it's like, what, 70% or something like that of our student population. So where do we go from here? Because money is not finite. We hope the Kerwin will come through, and that would be a huge help, but we don't know that that's going to happen. So I guess my question is, like, where do we go from here? I mean, we have some great recommendations that I will absolutely support that are in the report. But as the leaders, I think this is, this cannot be the same conversation that we have every year. What do you think? What is it? What are we missing here?
So I think we have to take a look at a couple of things. Dr. Smith has been very vocal that he very much looks forward to receiving Kerwin dollars. But even if not all the Kerwin dollars flow through, or any of them flow through, the recommendations are dead on, sort of as you mentioned, Mr. Rice, around looking at these areas of real true reform within the system. Part of our discussion here, and I think these are important to look at, the other piece that we also look at is the ends, the number of kids. So when you have disproportionately large influx of students from a specific group over time, it's important to look at that. And I was reflecting on the other slide that talked about graduation and looking at the graduation of English language learners, for example. It's a huge shift of difference between English language learners. The way I look at it from the chief academic perspective is I look at the ends. So we graduated more students than before that were English language learners, currently English language learners, and an important one is usually the kids who are, the young people who are graduating as ESOL students are students who are relatively new to our district, came in either in middle school or in high school. The cohorts that were ever English, ESOL, were students that came with us. So unpacking the performance of students is also unpacking the cohorts, how we impact the cohorts of students who are with us the longest and are thinking through how to do that. At the same time, we have to be reactive at the fact that any student can walk through the doors, and we need to provide them with a quality of education that really supports them. And part of that, I think, would come at a couple of different ways that we're fundamentally changing structures. Yes, the Board of Education with lots of feedback from the community, has been engaged in talking around attendance of, boundaries discussions, which always garner a lot of attention from our community around how to think about that. And in its priorities of how it makes decisions, there is obviously capacity, but also of the building, but it's also the question on the reflection of the community and the diversity component, which are important issues to tackle. I would tell you, Councilmember Navarro, that one of the things that we've been working in the last couple of years is fundamentally shifting some of these structures within schools with existing resources on how to fundamentally provide students different learning opportunities. So for English language learners that are coming very late with uninterrupted education, those students, we really want to do some programming that is different, and we look at a lot of the local resources that we've gotten, frankly, from local dollars, not federal, not state dollars, but local dollars, to be able to support programs like CREA and support sort of these alternative pathways that allow students to have a more meaningful learning environment at those places. The other piece is, I think the other type of structural changes where we're talking around who leads schools, who is in front of students, those we would love to be able to spend a little bit more time with the council and come back with more data on how we're looking at current shifts that we've been making in the last 2 years around who is leading schools and how do we think about which classes and which courses students are taking. And I think we are seeing some good structural movements, if you will, and those are the most difficult to make, frankly, on giving students the access, the resources, and then the supports once they are in those classes. Our Equal Opportunity Initiative has garnered a lot more students taking AP and IB courses, even as the enrollment of our students goes up every year, and the percentage of our students that are coming in are growing more as students coming from needing farm students and also students that are English language learners, and all those indicators. So I think it's just important to look at those indicators and unpack that data in that way so you can see real impact, because students are coming in and out of MCPS all the time.
So I appreciate that, and I think that it is laudable what we've been able to do with our ESOL students, right? And I understand the barriers there and some of the best practices that have been put in place with METS and Korea and everything. But what about our Black students, right? Because the data still shows that we are not doing what we need to do there. And, you can argue that we don't have that variable, right, of students coming in the middle of their high school or something to that effect. So in your opinion, what do you think is happening there?
Well, I think part of the work that we are doing programmatically is taking a look at every single student. And so part of the work that I would say in terms of our equal opportunity schools, as I mentioned, is looking at the number of students that are also taking coursework at a higher level than before, and that impacts our African-American students and their access to courses. I think also thinking about students who are affected by poverty and looking at the leadership and the teacher component. One of the things that came up in the ERS report that was important, and it's important to have these kind of reports come forward, and if everything that's reported in there, you already know, then what was the purpose? And I'll tell you, as a CAO, one of the things that I found very interesting in the ERS report is that our middle schools, as you mentioned, Mr. Rice, had the highest number of novice teachers. And you would have thought that the elementary teachers sometimes move into middle schools, and so middle school would actually have some teachers that have actually moved. Not so in our school system, which prompted us to rethink the emphasis of a couple of things. Be Well 365 honing in the middle school years, and also our teaching practices and our support practices in those very important middle school years. And I think that is a question around how we then, you saw some data on impact around mathematics. We were very intentional for a couple of years now around that mathematic support, but intentional also around the teaching supports of every single student. I think that's kind of how we're thinking about it from a programmatic perspective.
The last thing I will mention, obviously, one of the themes that we heard time and time again throughout our youth town halls. We had one in Clarksburg High School as well as Wheaton High School. And then something that we also discussed during our racial equity and social justice training was this idea of curriculum. Curriculum that is reflective of your student population, that goes a long way in helping engage students, because when they are able to see their history, when they are able to understand that, you know, part of the history and the ethos around our Black and brown students, you know, if you're obviously watching, you know, whatever, social media, if you're consuming social media, whatever, it's always just negative. And this notion of not having a proactive approach to really to teaching the real history of our Black and brown students as a way to also, you know, garner engagement and self-identity. It's very powerful and very important when it comes to this notion of engagement and will I learn from you? And I know that Dr. Smith did mention something about doing some kind of an audit of the social studies curriculum or something to the effect, but I just want to put that on the record again as a really important component, because it's not just obviously who's teaching me, but it's also what am I learning, and am I reflected in the lessons? Am I reflected in everything that is given to me on a daily basis? For a school system like ours, it's funny, you know, to be here for so many years and still, it touches me when I hear like Chris Lloyd talk about how DC public schools, that, you know, we have more students and farms at the DC public schools, because I'm the one who coined that fact back in the day when Jerry Wiest made the pronouncement of the red zone and green zone, and we were at a board meeting and it just hit me that this is who we were. And I said then, it's like we do have an urban school system within a suburban school system, and we have these issues of like our own identity crisis and not recognizing who we are. And so it is interesting to hear that being repeated so many years after, but the truth is that that's what we are, right? And so we cannot afford to wait for, you know, more reports to understand that there's some basics that we just have to do. And the curriculum piece is really big. You know, teachers that reflect our student population, principals that reflect our student population, those things also go a long way. And to those who may be naysayers and think that because we're going to do this, it's going to affect the quality of Montgomery County Public Schools, these changes have been going on for a long time, and it's still a very well sought after school system because it's a high functioning school system. So it will only be even better when we make those kinds of changes, right? So I just wanted to, you know, just put that on the record and express my appreciation, because what you're doing, this is part of that work. We're never going to get to where we're going to be unless we keep examining where we're missing the targets, right?
So, Councilmember Navarro, one of the things I wanted to also mention is, you know, the state has historically checked achievement starting in grade 3. And our office does the data, and we've been working with curriculum and instruction. And one of the things that we know that we need to do, because we always talk about readiness for kindergarten, but yet we only really serve 5,500 of our incoming 11,000 or so students. So really, we don't know a whole lot about those students until they hit the kindergarten classroom. So we are using an instrument and going to be doing some more periodic measurement for kindergarten, first and second grade schools to use, because we do not want students to go without proper interventions and intentional interventions on what they need for phonemic awareness, phonemic manipulation, and word usage. And so we are looking to do that as well, because the state has not forced that, and that is one of the areas that they say they're going to do in the ESSA reporting, is that there'll be an early childhood component, but we're developing our own until we hear more about that.
I appreciate that so
And that's a very intentional report to schools that'll say, this is how your students are starting with these basic skills on learning to read, and at the end of the year, who needs the interventions, and we're doing that by focus group. so that we can make sure that we're intentional when the students come back for first grade and we're ready to deliver that. So that is one area of attention that I think is a little bit different and an add-on to the curriculum pieces that we're doing.
Excellent, thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Chairman Rice, and to my colleague, Councilmember Navarro, for all your work over the years on this issue. Couple questions. I wanted to pick up on something Councilmember Navarro said before I ask my other questions. The curriculum point is such a key point, and I know that Dr. Daka and probably the whole board, but I've talked to her specifically about this point, about embedding the real history of this area, this country, into curriculum. And it obviously needs to happen even before it gets to our students. It needs to be happening in schools of education, because what the teachers and the administrators and the educators are bringing into the classroom with their expectation has a huge impact on their personal knowledge and expectations of students. So I would encourage, there's going to need to be some training of the trainer here, in the sense of, it's great the students are going to get it, but the educators are going to need it equally as much. And we've been in these racial equity trainings. There are basic facts about our history that I know that most people are not aware of, that impact how you come and approach different students. And I think it speaks to the point of, it's important for the students themselves, but it's the students of color, for example, but it's also important to everyone there, right? Because when I hear a student, a black cap student or someone else, which I've heard many, many times over the years, when they show up for a AP class or something, and they're told by the teacher, oh, are you in the wrong place? You need to be down the hall. That's a deeply seated expectation gap, and the teacher is probably not even consciously doing it, right? But or when a student thinks, oh, they're just in here, or a student tells them they're just in here because they're black or Latino, or they're the affirmative action person in this class. Again, that's why I just want to underscore why that curriculum point is so important. And if we're trying to really get at those core assumptions and beliefs, which I do think is part of our educational responsibility as well, as educating people to be in this society that we're in. I remember in 2004, one of the reasons I often tell people I not only started to work for then Senator Obama is because he said in the speech that we need to eradicate the slander that a black youth with a book is acting white. And I had never heard anyone say something like that in that way at that type of stage, but it still holds true, and I know we all can relate to our own examples of that. And so I'm so glad that Councilman Navarro mentioned that point, but that is just so deeply embedded into our students today, where they feel uncomfortable, or they're not sure if they're allowed to achieve. And when you look at these numbers, the expectations, all that is embedded in here. And if we don't have a strategy, if our strategy is not to address that, we're missing a huge, huge opportunity and piece of the puzzle. More specifically, on the boundary study, just quickly, my understanding is that it is looking at these schools, and this is more for the public in my confirmation, within areas geographically that are relatively close. You're looking at high poverty schools and low poverty schools, and the lines potentially how those could be adjusted, as opposed to you're not looking at a county-wide busing system. I just think we need to get that out on the record. And if you could explain the parameters just briefly of the boundary study.
So thank you for the opportunity to address this, because we're constantly, and we're actually engaging in community meetings, and probably Troy, I'll give the mic to him for a few minutes to talk a little bit about this, but we are engaged with community meetings in the upcoming months to be able, and we're working with a consulting firm to take a look at the entire county and the opportunities that are available. And the board looks at this with the context of geographic proximity for students, looking at the facility needs, looking at being able to provide students with options for learning in different settings. So it is important to note that what the first stage is to be able to engage our communities in this process. There's a lot of misconceptions about what the board is intending to do or not do without conversations. And so we really do feel like it is important to engage the communities, to take a look at the entire district and its opportunities that it affords. It's Mr. Body, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, and really trying to help to frame the conversations through that equity lens, because it really is about equity and opportunity for every one of our kids in the system. And looking at that diversity and how it benefits every kid, every adult, and our entire community, and really engaging in that conversation so that it is about having a world-class system for everybody. And so, Council Member Jawando, you said this isn't new earlier in terms of our growing diversity. But for some people, because we're so isolated in our communities, it is. And like through the work we do with delivering training throughout the school system and study circles, I'm still constantly amazed sometimes that this still isn't common dialogue, practice, and experience
Yeah.
of our community. And so that's the underlying work. So we've talked a lot about the outcomes and what happens, what the data looks like, but that work below is about how do we continue to help people to build that belief. You talked about President Obama's message about an African American with a book. I'm a proud graduate of Morehouse College, and that was one of our tenets, is like, you always have a book and you always have a pen. And so that is just something that's how I was educated. And so everybody does not see excellence in those areas, that African American and Latino kids can learn at high levels, are academically engaged, have aspiration and dreams just like everyone else. And so how do we continue to do that work where that is a common belief and a common vision for everyone, and align our practices, continue to align our practices to it, so those numbers start to change as well. So it's like that work below the surface, which you may not see in the conversations that people engage in and the conversations they have around data, to really promote learning for all kids.
I appreciate that, and in your point, just want to lift it up again, that this is to benefit our entire community, our entire system. We all do better when we all do better, whether it's our economy, any measure, our economy, we are one community, and I think getting that baseline understanding is very helpful. On the novice teacher and principal distribution, which was part of the ERS study, it showed that they were disproportionately in lower income schools where our students of color and farm students were. You mentioned that we're looking at that distribution now. That has been a commonly, as long as I've been involved in education policy, that stat of we know our lowest income, highest need students have the lowest, the least experienced teachers. That's been around for a while. It's been a number of years. Have we not been looking at that before? And if so, if not, which seemed to be embedded in your statement, and if not, why?
No, we have been looking at it,
Okay.
but looking at it comparatively across districts, and also looking at, my office just took a deep look at when our teachers transfer, what types of schools are they transferring to, and from what type of school are they moving from? And so we're looking at, if you look at our equity accountability model, we have taken our schools and we have divided them in accordance to the number of students who we consider to be impacted by special education, ESOL, or free and reduced meals. And so there's a stratification there of 0 to 20, 21 to 40, 41 to 60. And we are taking a look at the patterns of and who's moving, and actually talking with folks about those moves. And a surprising number of our teachers actually are transferring, but they're staying in the same level of impacted school. It might be because it's closer to home.
You have that data now borne out?
We have, yes, we just released a report on that. And so when they're moving, certainly a majority are moving to a less impacted school, absolutely, but not in every case.
You have a sense of that percentage? I'm sorry to cut you off, because I just want to.
I don't have
Because
that
I hear a
off the
lot
top
from
of my
teachers,
head.
and we know this burnout, I'm in a school, I really want to be here, but it's hard, and I don't necessarily, to Dr. Navarro's point, have the supports, and so 3 to 5 years, they move. I would love to have, I agree with Councilmember Navarro, we're going to need to have a part 2, maybe part 3 on.
Sure.
Because this is a structural issue that we know that the person in front of the student and every day, the administrator in the building, factor number 1, number 2, on how well they're going to do, right? And keeping the people who are most engaged, have the highest expectations, who have the proper training and the mindset in front. And I know you know this, but so knowing when they're leaving, why they're leaving, what supports they need, how can we bolster that?
I do want to clarify that the report, we focused on elementary for this certain
That one-
investigation. And it was really, Dr. Smith asked us to take a look at that in relationship to, as you well know, policies and other things guide the transfer of our staff.
Sure.
And so we need to take a deep examination, I use the word diagnostic a lot, of what is happening and why folks are moving and what kinds of supports maybe they are saying they need that we are not necessarily providing. And this is a part 1 elementary study. And I will have to check to see where it is in the pipeline from our program evaluators, but we certainly will share that information.
Just 2 very quick points around this issue. So elementary is very different because we have 136 elementary schools, so that's why it focused on elementary. There's a locus of control a little tighter around secondary, and the question in secondary, and I think it's pointed in the ERS report, is who is teaching which classes? What's the course scheduling and course load looking like? That is another component that we were not, that we have not been stagnant on and taking a look at. Dr. Smith was very clear around how we take a look at that and make an impact on that now. And I think OSA will have some additional data coming out around looking at the question on who's the teacher in front of you at the secondary level.
Right.
The other piece that I think is important that will be, we welcome this opportunity to come back at a later time, is that we've also been keeping track, as I mentioned earlier, on the novice school administrator in schools. And we've been looking at that carefully. I don't think we have that published yet, but taking a look at what that looks like across our schools. It was part of the ERS study, but we've been tracking it since, because as Dr. Wilson mentioned, it's 17, 18 data, and it looks better, just whispering over here on the mic. But we will put out the formal report and welcome the opportunity to share that information with the county council members.
I appreciate that. And go ahead.
I would just like to say the other area that I think our data systems are affording us an opportunity to do is to make sure that kids who have the same incoming proficiency rates moving into a new grade are getting placed in the same experience. And we just received a report on that from the beginning of the school year to what's happening now. And we were very elated about that. But I said, I'm going to celebrate that for the moment, but I'd like you to wait until our January second semester schedules come out to be sure that we're really seeing the changes that we believe we're seeing, because we need to make the transition at the semester time. So I think people are paying attention not only to the placement of the students, but also making sure that that placement based on their proficiency levels is exactly where it needs to be. And I will publicly say that for our students who came in with a level 5 proficiency rate on PARCC as 6th graders, 100% of the African American and Hispanic students were placed in algebra for 8th grade. That's up from the previous year. However, there's not enough ends. We need to push and get more students in a position to have that proficiency level that they need to have the access to the 7th grade algebra.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be part of my question. The decision that's made in elementary school of how to group to get that N number higher of which level math are you in, so you're even eligible to be testing at that level to get into algebra. That is real. That was one of the things in the ERA study that was striking as well, that in how those decisions are being made and how we're digging into that decision.
And we are very much engaged with our community to talk about the traditional math pathways and where we're gonna head moving forward. And the new curriculum allows us, first and foremost, tighter alignment and access for all students with a rigorous, aligned curriculum to the standards, which is base for anybody to be able to perform at their best performances. But we're also talking about how to be able to have pathways that don't track kids very early on, that actually prepare all students. And these are conversations that we are working with our teachers. I think we are hearing a lot from them around how to support them in supporting their students, but also structurally in the system. How do we make sure that all families feel like any transitions or changes in how we are approaching mathematics actually is benefiting everybody? And that is a huge piece, because the request is, like Dr. Wilson just said, sure, the ends, we need to increase the ends, and we know we have the capability to be able to support a lot more students being able to perform across those high standards, all students. And so I think this is going to continue to be the point of discussions around changing some of those structural pieces that allow every student a core, strong mathematical access in those elementary years that better help them transition to more rigorous math as they choose to, right? So there's also an importance of appropriateness of mathematics, but that it is not necessarily able to be differentiated in any kind of way for one group over another group, that it's all accessible.
I appreciate that. And my last question, the report focused a lot on the compensatory education funding, and I don't think we really dug into that, and I think it would be a disservice to all the great work of Dr. Bonner Tompkins. So could you explain where that 46 million or so is going? Why is that discrepancy? Where is it going? It also, in the report, it cites that MCPS expended less per student in general funds on high poverty compared to low poverty schools, 500 more per student in the general funds on low poverty elementary than on high poverty, and 200 more per student on low poverty middle schools compared to high poverty middle school schools. That was from 78, around page 78. And just, I know you have an explanation for that, but I think it's important, as I always say, for the millions watching at home, and for you all also, we're talking about N numbers, we're talking about number of students in the sample size. But could you explain your logic on that and what you're using that money for and where it's going?
So, we welcome the opportunity to spend perhaps a little bit more time unpacking the compensatory services discussion, because what we think about in terms of direct funds for students is also to support the general programming of students. And so we're looking at some of the numbers in terms of taking a look at the supports for compensatory services actually being utilized to support the programming that we want more of the student populations that we discussed today to access. So for us is being able to provide the supports directly and indirectly through funding for those students. I think there's a couple of examples that we would like to be able, and can we show the slide number 4? I'm sorry, Elaine.
So for some reason, my screen is locked.
Okay, no problem. So one of the things that we have, and in your handouts, we actually, when we did the resource allocation studies, we actually asked ERS to compare us to peer districts in terms of how the funding is being utilized and how it's being supported. And there were two Yep, that one. There were two areas that I think we want to acknowledge. And first, I just want to say that it is a welcome discussion because we're not doing everything perfectly right. And I think it's just important to pinpoint the areas that we can move to improve on. So in the report, with all due respect to the OLO folks, our data shows a little bit difference in how we are actually appropriating funds for low-income students and our students with disabilities. Where this report, and I think we align to, and we've been thinking about this, is around supporting English language learners. Because if you notice in this table, it does show us slightly below comparable school districts. And we looked at comparable school districts because it's just important to compare. Sometimes within the state, we can find comparable, but it's important to find other school districts in terms of how they're making decisions with similar populations. And we've been working on the ESO, and I think to your point, Mr. Rice and Ms. Navarro, about asking about what the superintendent is going to ask for, while we've talked about having to utilize our resources better and fundamentally making some structural changes, we will be asking for additional resources and being very strategic in the recommendation that will be coming to the superintendent, to the board, around supports, particularly supporting English language learners. And frankly, with the rise of students that we had this year, the superintendent has twice allocated additional teacher supports just this year, and we haven't even finished the fall semester, to offset the fact that we had students that we did not project from and are very excited and welcome and very excited to have them with us. But they walked through the doors in July, a lot in August and September, and continue to, that we just did not, we were not expecting this high number. So as a response immediately, the superintendent has released additional staffing to schools and will continue to do so, and will be part of the probably the way we request funding moving forward.
Can I just say, though, I understand that and I appreciate that, but again, this sounds very familiar, right? You know, it's kind of like every time we have some kind of a report, the answer or the response is that, you know, we're going to request more money. And so I just want to make sure that we understand that I think this particular OLO report has highlighted some really important aspects of how the money that we have been allocating, which has been considerable, is utilized. And caution that it's not always about asking for more money, right? That it is about how is the current funding being utilized according to the needs of the student population that is there. So I just want to say that because after a while, you know, it just feels very uncomfortable that every time we start analyzing the data and trying to figure out where the money is being strategically invested, that the response is we're going to ask for more and more and more money. Of course, I mean, obviously, but the question is what is that number? Like, you know, is it $15 billion?
Right.
Is it 20? I mean, like, what is that number? And I think that at some point we really need to have that conversation because it's significant when we're investing at this moment in time. And the goalpost keeps getting, you know, further and further out. So I just want to say that for the record, because I've often asked myself that. It's like, you know, how much is enough to close these gaps?
Yeah. And I appreciate the council president, or the immediate past council president, Councilmember Navarro. And I want to let Dr. Tompkins, I know she wanted to say something, but I personally, and I think my colleagues, I need to have that deeper dive on the number discrepancy. It's not almost $50 million. What's going on before we could entertain like additional funding? I think we need to figure that out and have that discussion. And we don't have to do it all today, but we need to figure that out.
And the only thing I wanted to add in response to the ERS finding that MCPS is spending more on compensatory education than peers, those peers all have higher poverty levels, and those peers, except for Boston, all spend less per student than, they have lower budgets per student than MCPS. So I just caution that, of course, the information is correct around these comparison school systems, but to call them peers is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, and so let me say this. I think that, again, as we have this overall totality of a discussion around what our education system is going to look like in the future, which is what we're trying to get towards, there are multiple things that are at play. Certainly, MCPS, in its own vision of its new framework, is certainly trying to move forward in a direction that addresses some of this. You've got Kerwin out there that's doing some of that. You've got Black and Brown Coalition who's doing some of that. And so we all need to coalesce around some of these things that make sense for us in terms of how best to move forward. Bringing in the community, making sure that they're aligned with what we're looking at from our state folks who may be putting forth regulations specifically that require us to do certain things and put money behind certain things. You know, if you go directly with current commission recommendations, some of that directly says compensatory ed, you can't spend it on anything else. And so those are requirements that are there. So that may not even be an option moving forward, right? So there's a lot that's there that's kind of floating that we don't know, but I do think it's important for us to start to prepare for those conversations, prepare for that kind of reality. And so from that perspective, I do see that we have another education and culture meeting that is on January 27th. I know Mr. Howard had to step out, but I will be following up with him to see if we can do a follow-up. It would give us a little bit of an opportunity to see what a first current commission bill may be as well. So we'll be able to tie all of that in together to be able to have us have a little bit more of an informed conversation. I will say from here, though, however, as a part of our conversation today, it's very clear that the recommendations that Dr. Bonner-Tompkins put forward are ones that I find, and I think that my colleagues will find as reasonable in terms of what it is that we're looking for that align with that conversation on the 27th anyway. And I'll just read them for, as Councilmember Giwando says, the millions that are watching at home that may not have this packet in front of them. But part of the recommendations included developing a council resolution requesting the Board of Education develop an integration and equitable funding plan to address existing opportunity gaps, encourage the state of Maryland to require the Board of Education to expend all state compensatory education revenue on low-income students in high-poverty schools, request the Board of Education to earmark county funding above state maintenance of effort requirements for compensatory education and ESOL programs, and to request the Board of Education annually report on student performance and resource allocations for general, special, and compensatory ed and ESOL programs analogous to the OLO report of 2019. And then there's another set which kind of encompasses a letter specifically to the Board of Education that would be along the lines of asking them to hold their own briefing on the OLO report, as well as adopting a racial equity and social justice policy analogous to what the county has done, and to partner with the county government and local entities in terms of a community of practice aimed at advancing racial equity and social justice in governmental decision making. So I think that whether this encompasses 2 or 3, I'm not sure of yet in terms of how many we can consolidate together, because some of these are overlapping. And so I think that there's unanimous support around all of these encompassed in some kind of way, and we can work together on what that may look like and who it would go to. But certainly with all of these, you know, some of them are clearer than others, could go to multiple sources. So there may be some that'll be encompassed in both, in multiple letters or in the resolution. So I think that we're there from that perspective. I really want to say this. This work isn't easy. There's no question that the school system is committed to making the change. It's hard when you don't have all the answers. And so no one has been able to come up with all the answers and say, oh, this is the way in which to address the achievement, equity, opportunity gaps in our system if you only did this. And it's not as if you had that and then said, well, we're going to choose to do it in a different direction. So while this is a moral imperative for us, I do not hold the school system responsible for creating the problem. But I do say that we, as a collective community, do own the responsibility of trying to come up with a solution. And so from that perspective, you know, I think that everybody's trying to do it in their own space and figure out what works and what makes sense. MCPS has certainly tried, and Montgomery County has tried. to certainly do this, and we know some things have worked and some things haven't worked so well. And so from that perspective, we continue to reinvent these methodologies that are going to get us the best results. And so that's what you hear us saying, that when you're asking about money, we want to make sure that the money is going directly to something that we know, because we've seen success in some areas, that is going to achieve that, instead of just doing and I'm not criticizing the Massachusetts model, but the Massachusetts model, that still put a lot of money in the system and still didn't accomplish everything that they wanted to. I think that we can do better. Massachusetts has said that we can do better, and so certainly I believe in us that we can do better as well. So I really want to thank Dr. Bonner-Tompkins again for her great work and her continued advocacy. I really want to thank MCPS and all of our advocates, our union partners that continue to work each and every day to try and make us a better system. We will get it done because we have too many people who care about getting it done. And so from that perspective, I have promise. So with that, we are adjourned, and we will reconvene on the 27th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.